This video is about the European Union, specifically examining it within the context of European history and how we should interpret and understand it in that context, what the purpose of the European Union may be, and what the European Union means for the future of Europe. This video is also sponsored by Enlisted. Enlisted is a first-person shooter set during the Second World War. You can play the game for free on PC, Xbox and PlayStation. It includes campaigns set in the Pacific, the Eastern Front, the Battle of Normandy and North Africa. I personally prefer playing the Pacific campaign the most, since that scenario is often ignored by other games. If you played first-person shooters before, you should feel right at home. You join the game for free and pick a squad specialization, from infantryman to sniper, machine gunner, tanker or flamethrower. As you progress with your squad through the game, you will earn XP points to upgrade your squad and gear. There are also various different game modes to choose from invasion, that positions one team on the defense while the other has to take the ground, to armored train escort, where one side has to protect an armored train from another. You can download and play the game for free by using the link in the description. If you use that link, you will also gain access to 3 days of premium time and several orders for troops and weapons. Thank you to Enlisted for sponsoring this video. Conversations about the historical context of political development in which we ought to understand the European Union are some of the most divisive of our time. We Europeans love to tear each other apart over this issue. What even is the European Union? How should we understand the development of the European Union in the context of historical political developments? I'm going to make this video opening that can of worms to enjoy the circus and chaos that will evidently result in the comment sections. One of the most insightful perspectives I ever got on what the European Union may be is from a conversation I had with a viewer from China in my Discord server. He told me that from his perspective of interpreting history as a Chinese national, the worst thing that ever happened to Europe was the collapse of the Roman Empire. He draws parallels between the history of Rome and the histories of the Qin and Han dynasties. Both set out on a task of unifying their regions and binding a patchwork of cultures together under a civilization state. But whereas the Qin and Han succeeded in creating the foundations of a Chinese civilization state, the Romans failed. For centuries to come, different Europeans would desperately try to revive the project of the European civilization state, to create a middle kingdom of Europe of sorts, but all of them failed. Instead, Europe became a place of deep divisions which undermined the creation of a unified European civilizational polity, and instead created nations. They expanded outside of Europe by imperialism in attempts to collect the resources needed to unite Europe. By mistake, created American civilization and exported their systems of ethnic and religious political divisions to places like Africa and Asia. This European imperialism ultimately failed, and the European Union, from his perspective, is the latest attempt to finalize and create a post-imperial unified European civilizational state. He explained that to him and to many of his Chinese compatriots, the European Union is viewed favorably. For if it would come to be as a civilizational polity that unifies Europe, they believe that its emphasis on social democracy and regulated markets over the ruthless capitalism of the United States will lead to a split between the two and thereby further the creation of a multipolar world. Now, I do not agree with our Chinese viewer. In particular, his concept of civilization and his geopolitical biases are also very clear. But nonetheless, I find it very interesting and worth presenting. It certainly is an interesting perspective on how European imperialism came to be, but it also gives a twist on a popular way of interpreting history. In essence, our Chinese friend is saying, actually, you Europeans are the backward ones. We Chinese resolved the question of establishing a common civilizational polity over 3,000 years ago, while you failed. You instead adopted the nation, and the nation is a political regression that is inferior to the civilizational polity. But you Europeans are gradually on the road to accomplishing what we Chinese accomplished 3,000 years before you, and we welcome your progress. Now, I disagree with this narrative, but there is one thing in particular regarding European political development on which our Chinese friend is, in my opinion, correct. The European Union is a post-imperial political project. A project that not only strives to overcome conflict among nation-states, but a project that seeks to build an alternative to imperialism. Overcoming conflict between nation-states is one of the main stated goals of the European political project. The common fiction that many Europeans tell themselves to be the foundation of the European Union is the myth of the state that learned from history. That Europeans, after decades of bloodshed and violence, decided to learn from history. Determined that to avoid conflict, Europeans needed to learn to share among themselves and therefore created a unique system of international cooperation. Far-right critics of the European Union often invoke an opposing political fiction, the golden era of nationalism from the 1920s to 1930s, that the collapse of European empires during the First World War led to the almost natural development into smaller nation-states based on nationality defined through language or ethnicity, who supposedly existed in peace. Now, besides the fact that anyone who praises the politics of 1930s Europe is always kinda suspicious anyway, this idea is also generally untrue. The interwar period was not an era of peace. In fact, this era contains the most wars fought in Europe during the 20th century. The Soviet invasion of Georgia, the Soviet invasion of Armenia, the Soviet invasion of Azerbaijan, the Soviet invasion of Ukraine, the first Soviet invasion of Poland, the first Soviet invasion of Finland, the first Soviet invasion of Estonia, the first Soviet invasion of Lithuania, and the first Soviet invasion of Latvia. What these wars, almost all involving the Soviet Union, show us is that the death of Central European and Eastern European traditional empires almost instantly resulted in the re-emergence of new European empires to take their place. Especially the early 1920s saw an extremely aggressive new Soviet empire attempting to conquer and subjugate much of Eastern Europe. Now, to be fair, right-wing historians acknowledge this, and they describe communism as an attempt at eradication of the nation-state by a new form of imperialism. However, here is something that far-right historians often tend to ignore. The Polish-Ukrainian War, the Georgian-Armenian War, the Georgian-Turkish War, the Armenian-Azerbaijani War, the Greek-Turkish War, the Polish-Lithuanian War, the Hungarian-Romanian War, the Hungarian-Czechoslovak War, the Greek-Bulgarian War, and the Czechoslovak-Polish War. The interwar period saw almost all new nation-states born from the First World War engage in border disputes and expansionist squabbles over who owned what. Often these squabbles were not even about ethnic or lingual groups who lived on disputed lands, but over resources. The Czechoslovak-Polish War was, for example, fought over a region of Silesia that was majority Czech and German, but which the Poles wanted because of its enormous coal deposits. The reason for all of these conflicts is that the idea of a self-limiting nation-state did not exist at that time. Nationalism, as created in the 1800s right up to the 1920s, was a political force that in fact actively tried to build spheres of influence over peoples outside of one's respective nationality. Many European nationalist movements in fact built upon an idea of their own cultural or ethnic superiority and saw it as part of their nation-creating mission to domineer over others on that basis. The self-limiting nationalism that argues for a nation-state that deliberately shuns spheres of influence over others is not even a Western European political innovation, but a Turkish one. Atatürk was the first political thinker to formulate that idea in the late 1920s. It is one of the founding pillars of Kemalism and the reason why Kemalists advocate for Turkish isolationism. In many ways, our modern understanding of nationalism was invented by the Turks. The collapse of European empires is similar to the collapse of Yugoslavia, resulting in the emergence of fresh states who instantly engaged in petty squabbles over who owned what and who was what. The way Serb nationalists formulated political fictions that declared Montenegrins as an inherent cultural part bound to Serbia in many ways reminds me of how the Czechs created a fiction of the Slovaks as an inherently bound part of Czechia. There was no golden age of European nation-states and nationalism, as many right-wing critics of the European Union claim. The era of European nation-states were 2 decades of war and instability, and it is this squabbling and conflict between states that is the mission of the European Union to overcome. Many non-Europeans often overlook this aspect and purpose of the European Union and of modern European politics: reconciliation. In 1984, the French president François Mitterrand and the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl met at Verdun, the site of the most vicious fighting of the First World War. They stood at the coffin of an unknown soldier who was draped in the flag of both nations, held hands and attended over a ceremony of remembrance together. Rituals like these are a core component of the success of the European project and have to be maintained for that project to continue and succeed. We tend to overlook the importance of ritual in politics, but rituals, no matter how much they may or may not be formalized, lie at the center of all political engagement. And the rituals of reconciliation are an important pillar of what the European Union is built upon. It is a promise that enables economic cooperation in the first place. Some non-Europeans often dismiss this as little more than an expression of a supposedly masochistic German guilt, but these state rituals in fact should not be labeled as such. They are essential to creating a political understanding of preserving a common peace, and they are not only conducted by Germany. When the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe ended, all the newly liberated countries engaged in foreign policies of reconciliation and peace to overcome any and all enmities that may still remain from the interwar period. Bulgaria and Greece also underwent this process of reconciliation during the 1920s, so did Italy and Greece before. But this process has also on occasion failed, most prominently between Hungary and many of its neighbors. The Orban government, through its constant denial of the sovereign integrity of its neighbors, is a factor that continuously undermines and challenges the core foundation of reconciliation in European politics. A process of reconciliation and friendship between Greece and Turkey was successful throughout the 2000s, but then unfortunately collapsed during the 2010s. But by far the biggest failure in European reconciliation was with Russia. 2 consecutive German governments invested in an energy policy that they believed would result in an economic codependence that would guarantee peace. And while there was hope in the early 2010s of a reconciliation between Russia and Poland, Russia eventually destroyed any hopes of reconciliation with Europe. So to summarize, one of the foundations of modern Europe as a political entity is not the destruction of individual nation-states, but the facilitation of peace through reconciliation. And importantly, as Russian gas shows us, reconciliation must come before economic cooperation. And to ensure cooperation can continue, this process of reconciliation, as well as the rituals of reconciliation, must be continued. Those who disrupt this process should be sanctioned for doing so. And if the European Union is to expand, it must export this process as a requirement to those who wish to apply. Another aspect of understanding the European Union in its political context of development is to create a political system of organization that can persevere in a post-imperial age. And this is where I agree but also disagree with our Chinese friend. There's a political thinker from before the European Union whose ideas in many ways predate the European Union, but can also in some ways be found within the aspects of the European Union, be it intentional or not. Józef Piłsudski, the leader of the First Polish Republic. The political mission of his state was a political idea that is largely forgotten today, called Prometheanism. Piłsudski and other Polish intellectuals of the Polish independence movement believed that imperialism was a form of political organization that was doomed to fail, and that they lived during the era of its demise. Poland was one of the first nations to attain independence from the death of imperialism, and it was therefore Poland's national duty to not build a new Polish empire, but to hasten the process of killing imperialism in its entirety. And Poland's principal target of this ought to be the destruction of Russian imperialism by supporting any and all independence movements within its borders, because Russian imperialism was the primary threat to Polish statehood. Piłsudski also correctly asserted that the Soviet Union was not a new means of political organization, but just a rebranded Russian imperialism. As part of Prometheanism, Poland ought to help create a geopolitical sphere called the Intermarium, a federation of all states in a triangle between the Baltic, Black and Adriatic Seas, as a common economic and military alliance against the aggressive imperial ambitions of Russia, Germany and Italy. Now, none of this ever came to be. If it had, it would have probably prevented the Second World War. Poland itself ended up bickering with many of its neighbors throughout the European nation-state bickerings of the 1920s and 1930s. But the historical realities aside, there is a core truth to what Piłsudski believed, and an important truth as well. The key to overcoming and resisting imperialism is for nation-states, who would usually fall victim to imperialism, to cooperate together. Piłsudski's ghost can very much be seen in the policies of the former Soviet bloc in Europe. Cooperation to withstand outside aggression. And this in some sense is one of the key promises of the modern European project. Reconciliation does not only offer the prospect of economic cooperation, but comes with the promise of protection from empire, to create a political structure that can overcome empire. Curiously enough though, almost all the founding countries of the European Union were not nation-states, but European empires. They either still had overseas empires or were recent European empires. Britain was also an empire when it joined. It is important to acknowledge and admit the fact that the European Union was created by dying and dead empires, who sought out a means of existence after empire. This also helps us understand modern political myths and misconceptions. A large part of the Brexit campaign, for example, was driven on the promise of returning to an imagined great past when Britain was just a nation-state. This is a lie. Britain never existed as a nation-state before the European Union. It only existed as an empire. When Britain joined the common market, it was still an overseas empire that could hitch onto its foreign properties to stay afloat and dictate policies to others. Britain joined so it could take part in cooperation with Europeans to stay afloat as its empire died. Britain, as a sole nation-state without an empire, only exists since 2016 after Brexit, and the British, through that decision, are now forced the hard way to confront the fact that they are no longer an empire and no longer in a position to dictate policy to anyone. In many ways, the European project came to similar conclusions as Pilsudski and the Prometheans had in the 1920s. The foundations of a post-imperial political order must be cooperation of nation-states and the abandoning of imperial ambitions. This harbors potential conflict in Europe's future. France is Europe's last empire. And one thing our Chinese viewer is correct about is that European empires used resources from colonies to gain advantages in the power struggles of Europe. France also uses its overseas spheres of influence, in particular in Africa, to gain advantages in Europe today and thereby cause resentments and hinder European integration. An example, France is proud of its energy independence through nuclear power. Half of the French nuclear fuel comes from Canada, but the rest comes from mines in its African sphere of influence. If it loses its African sphere of influence, it will either have to purchase more expensive nuclear fuel from Canada, Australia or the United States, or turn to a European solution of cooperation. Ukraine has the largest uranium deposits in Europe. To get cheap Ukrainian uranium, France would have to stop blocking Ukrainian European Union membership. But through this compromise, it would have to allow Ukraine to sell its cheap agricultural produce to compete with French agricultural produce. As you can see, the fact that France still clings on to remnants of its empire comes as a detriment to a further European integration, because it means that France can avoid compromises that it else would have to make. And that is the core sacrifice that every participant in the European project makes. Everyone always has to compromise. Everyone has to make some sacrifices in order to benefit together with all in common. France keeping its empire gives it an unjust advantage in the process, and many European countries are increasingly unhappy with this. To maintain cooperation with Europe, France will have to probably let go of its influence in Africa in the near future. And here is where I disagree with our Chinese friend. I do not see the European political project as just another empire, or the attempted creation of a European civilizational polity as a player in a multipolar world. I believe its model of national cooperation is a framework that in the long term can undermine the entire concept of polarity and create a post-imperial world. And for that to succeed, the concept must also be promoted abroad. This is something often pointed out by Portuguese politicians who argue that Europe should seek deeper ties, cooperation and trade with the Mercosur, African Union and ASEAN rather than with the United States. That Europe should promote national cooperation through the Mercosur, African Union and ASEAN as an alternative to being in an American sphere of influence or a Chinese sphere of influence. In summary, that cooperation between nation-states as a political development can function as a mechanism to overcome imperialism and create the post-imperial world. Thank you again to Enlisted for sponsoring this video. Remember to get your free bonus right now with the link in the description. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so through Patreon, PayPal or Ko-fi. Links are in the description. If you would like to discuss this video with other subscribers or with me, you can do so by joining our Discord. Thank you again for watching. I hope to see you all again soon.